Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe.
I'm Glen Cerny, and we welcome you to another edition of Your Legislators, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Senator John Arthur Smith from Deming. And first of all, Senator Smith, while we celebrate our 50th anniversary, believe it or not, this is the 9th year we've been doing Your Legislators, and I believe you were one of the first people we had on 9 years ago.
9 years ago. And well, that's something. I don't know how much has changed.
Well, that's what I was when I was preparing questions. I'm going, I'd like to look at my sheet from 9 years ago and see where we're at. But elected first in 1989 from the 35th district. Can you kind of explain where the 35th district is and what it covers?
The 35th district now covers, since the last reapportionment, Hidalgo County, Luna County, Sierra County, and the west side of Doña Ana County.
We've got the long session this year. That means a lot more time up in Santa Fe. Let's start things off by talking a little bit about the budget, and it's been proposed by the Finance Committee for about $6.3 billion. Are you comfortable that that's going to be comparable to what the governor will put forth?
Well, you know, the entire process, we have a consensus revenue forecast with the executive branch. And so that total number is in line with what the legislature and the executive branch have agreed to. So I'm very, very confident, given that scenario, that at least that's the number we'll be starting from. Now, there's some contingencies there, and one of them's in the process of happening right now, and that is the reliability of that revenue. And it's being challenged, and it's a great windfall for those of us that have to fill up with gasoline, but it's very detrimental with what's happening to the price of oil, that the revenues to the state are going to be pretty anemic compared to what we thought they were going to be back in August.
I say this as a high compliment, but I think in my 9 years of watching the legislature, you may be the most skeptical person of revenue predictions up in Santa Fe. And again, that's high compliment. That you always seem to want to keep a little lower number than what may actually be there.
Well, you know, since it was the 50th anniversary for you doing this, on the 50th anniversary, that was probably 8 or 10 years ago with the Legislative Finance Committee, for the very, very first time, did members of the Legislative Finance Committee on the Senate side only, disagree with the revenue forecast that at that time Governor Richardson had subscribed to. And as it turned out, it was pretty lonesome when you were saying we're going to have to spend less money. But as it turned out, the Senate Finance Committee was absolutely right with what we did. But it was pretty rough waters to negotiate with your colleagues that were anxious to spend more dollars when you were telling them that those revenue forecasts were not accurate. And there's a certain amount of credit you have to give to the doubters of what we had forecast. My degree's in biology, it's not in economics. And so that's not a reassuring curriculum for people that are trying to work with financial numbers. But the results were that we were absolutely right that at that particular time, and we're going back about 6 years ago, when we said we're not going to accept the consensus revenue forecast, we're going to target below that. And unfortunately, we were right, and painful cutting was in order, but we survived. The sun came up the next morning, and
the land's still enchanted.
It's still enchanted. So that is sort of the history of when you look at the consensus revenue forecast. And for the first time, it had been challenged by a legislative member, and I'm proud to say it was challenged by the Senate Finance Committee people.
Well, let's with another forecast on the horizon, but right now the number being generally thrown around is about 140 million of additional revenue to be pondered what to do with. That's still a fairly large number when you look back the last 5 years.
It's a sizable number. That number was up to 285 million in August of this year, and it was reduced in December to 141 million. The executive signed off on that number. The Legislative Finance Committee signed off on that number, but we had a press release last Friday, and I think I expressed a point that we're a little bit skeptical on that 141 million of new dollars being sustainable. That 141 million new dollars was based on $66 oil, and today as we're talking, it's probably down around $46. And now, as Professor Peach over here tells you, not to look at it at one time, but look at it collectively over a year's time frame. If that sustains itself, it's going to be a pretty painful year for us on that. But right now, we're down on that revenue forecast of $141 million, we're down about $140 million in theory just on oil alone.
Well, and it also has some peripheral kind of effect. I mean, exploration slows down. I mean, there's some other things that this low gas price kind of drags with it in addition to the revenue projections.
Well, and that's where some super guesswork comes along. In theory, with additional disposable income that's as a result of low gasoline prices, in theory the people will go out and make more purchases at retail and will be paying more tax dollars. The time frame of that to kick in, that additional revenue to offset the oil, is sort of the unknown land. And as a result, we do believe there's going to be a bump, but we don't know quite when it's going to happen. But in addition to the severance monies that we were getting from oil, you're going to have layoffs in the oil fields. And so you're going to lose some gross receipt potential dollars and income tax dollars on that. So trying to read the tea leaves and determine what that's going to be is a challenge.
You know, I'd be willing to bet you right now that if we looked at the questions I asked you 9 years ago, education was on that list of questions. And there are challenges with education, and the governor's made it pretty clear that she wants to concentrate on some of those. So if I can break education up a little bit, let's start. There's two interim director secretaries. Barbara Dameron with the higher education, and Hannah Scandera is the Secretary of Education. Any feelings on how that's going to progress in the Senate in this legislative session?
Well, Secretary Scandera has been sort of the subject of discussion for 4 years now. And what people don't realize, whether she's confirmed or not, she will still be able to do the job. The bottom line is that she will be there. I'm hoping, Senator Papin made a remark the other day that we need to get this issue behind us and either vote it up or down and move forward with it. But even if she is rejected by the Senate, she will be able to serve. The governor may have to move that secretary to a deputy position, but they'll be calling all the shots. And President of New Mexico State University sort of taught the legislature about that with Carla Muth back in about 1990, 1989, when his Secretary of Health, as I recall, was not confirmed, but she ran the show after that was said and done.
The same situation for Barbara Dameron, the designate for higher education department?
She is a brand new replacement. I really don't know much about the lady, but she's I think a professor, a nurse professor.
From the Albuquerque area.
From the Albuquerque area, and I think her husband ran for higher office at one time. But my take on it, executives, regardless of party line, are entitled to their selection. And unless there's something in their deep past that would reject, then I would encourage that we accept the executive's recommendations.
Another topic that has been, again, being bandied around on a pretty regular basis is third grade retention. Social promotion is another way of looking at it. Will there be any action on that front?
You know, I've carried that piece of legislation with Senator Engel and Senator Gay Kernan from Southeast New Mexico. She's a retired educator. My wife's a retired educator. And everybody, I often tell this story about myself. I don't have a problem. The last thing we want to do, we don't want to retain. We want to get in there and correct it before you have to reach retention level. But when I was in the second grade, I was held back because I could not read. And my teacher at the time that I dearly loved had already consulted with my parents about that, unbeknownst to me until later.
Yeah.
And she came up to me and she said, "John, I'm really going to have a tough class this next year. Would you mind staying in my class another year to help me?" And I was delighted to stay in her class because I was in love with my second grade teacher. And I think it really reflects the approach that a true educator can communicate that need. And she was very successful in that arena, and I really don't object to a retention, but I would rather have intervention on the front door to reduce the numbers. The numbers are huge right now. You know, the higher education departments are putting out reading specialists, reading coaches to teach educators how to teach reading, and that was something when you and I were going to school that we never heard of. That was sort of expected, and I have a tough time accepting the fact that reading by the third grade is now classified as reform.
Well, and I think we should add that the issue is if the theory is if you're not reading by the third, you can't learn in 7, 8, and 9, and I think there's unquestionably some truth to that. But graduation rates continue to be a challenge for New Mexico, although it has improved some.
Well, with my wife, and my wife was an early childhood educator, basically first through third grade. And I can tell you from watching, observing, and lesson plans that she would plan at home on that, and the concern that she expressed for different groups within her class. You know, that is not easy teaching reading for an elementary teacher. It is hard, tough work, but the bottom line is that it has to be done, and if we're going to get improved results, it is absolutely necessary that they read at a very, very early age.
Let's change some gears, and again, I know it's a subject that you have consistently voiced concern in, and that's roads and transportation issues in New Mexico. I'd be willing to bet you could almost tell me exactly how many bridges you cross alone going from Deming up to Santa Fe.
Well, I really can't count that, but I've done it several times in the 26 years that I've served. It seems to me, regardless of party affiliation, each governor doesn't want to step the plate with what is absolutely necessary to maintain and repair roads. Invariably, we'll get big roads, overpasses in Albuquerque. We did get the 4-lane from Farmington to Albuquerque. We used bond money at the time that I wasn't supportive of. We're servicing debt of about $165 million a year on bond money for road construction, but we still have the same gasoline tax that we had 26 years ago. And that is now in the 17-cent range, 18-cent range. And on that, and local governments are getting about 3 cents out of that, and it now has about the buying power of maybe half of what it did 26 years ago. So one of these days, we're going to have a governor that takes the bull by the horn, so to speak, and take the leadership initiative and say this is going to have to be done. Nobody likes gasoline tax, but if you're ever going to have to raise additional revenues on gasoline tax, now would be the time. It needs to be dedicated, and the public needs to know that it's going for roads. And I will be introducing legislation on that, where the bulk of those dollars will be going to local governments for residential streets repairs and replacement.
Well, when you think about it, we're what, the 5th largest state in the country, and the number of roads, and how imperative is I mean, forget about product being delivered. Just for us to get around in New Mexico requires a massive miles of pavement.
Well, you're absolutely right, but most of the public believes that electricity needs to be free and roads need to be free, but somebody has to pay for them. And you know, if you poll those issues, what I was fixing to say, they're extremely popular to say, I'm not going to raise taxes, but it may not be responsible. You know, at the federal level, it was extremely popular to say we're pulling out of Iraq. Guess what? We're back in there. It may not have been the responsible thing to do when we did it. And that's sort of what we're doing when we come off of the heels of an election where promises have been made by legislative members, no new taxes, by executive branch, no new taxes. But sometimes you have to step to the plate and do what's responsible, not to mention the jobs it would create in the state.
Well, and the reality is at some point you're going to have to pay the piper or pay a very high price of inactivity and the inability to move freely.
Well, you know, I've said I'm going to dedicate most of mine to local metropolitan areas, municipalities. One of the options local government has, if they want, is to have paving districts and assess the property owners. I'm trying to export some of that cost to the traveling public on I-10, I-40, and I-25.
You know, we've kind of skirted around the economy on several occasions, and there's two pieces of legislation that we've tried to establish in New Mexico. One of them is the Local Economic Development Act, or LEDA, and the other one is the deal closing funds. Are you hopeful for the success of those two elements?
Well, the governor has recommended $50 million on the LEDA funds. I think the legislative budget has it at about $30 million. Both her recommendation and the Legislative Finance Committee is $25 million in general fund money and $5 million from the legislature from mortgage finance, and I think she's taken $20 million from that. I am not a strong advocate for political deals to attract business. I would rather see a long-term responsible plan rather than a political deal. If you keep giving honeymoons, people will come for the honeymoon, but the divorce will be quicker when you suspend those dollars. So I would like to set our economic development based on a plan and not a political deal. And all governors are, because it polls well, they're wanting political deals because it's got to happen within their term of office, which is very quick. But I think we've been very remiss as a state not utilizing long-term planning from a business model standpoint.
Now that sounds like it's going to need a lot of collaboration to pull together. And I've got to lead into this question by stating the separation of power is something that's very explicit, but the Senate has a long reputation in New Mexico of not cooperating with the governor, and let me word it a little nicer, being free thinkers. Is that a polite way to put it?
Well, you know, if people will roll back to their school days, we were well educated in our civic classes, the separation of powers. And we're all a check and balance on one another. And when you come in and you rubber stamp an executive, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, I don't think you're exercising your constitutional responsibilities if you're just going to climb on board and do whatever the governor wants. I have basically been at odds with executives because I've subscribed to that, and every executive will say, I've got a mandate of the people on that. But I also believe we have to be responsible. If the executive has a responsible request, I have absolutely no problem in assisting an executive to be successful. But if there's an area where I think they've overreached, they need to be checked, I'm willing to stand to the plate and challenge.
Any feeling on the cooperation with the House during this session?
You know, I've always worked closely with the House. In New Mexico, a lot of people are not aware of it, but during the summer months, we have House and Senate committees, not separate committees, but combined committees. And so you have an opportunity to really get to know the House members that serve on those committees. Legislative Finance Committee is a prime example. We know their families. And so there's absolutely no reason at all, for the most part, that we shouldn't be able to get together and work collectively for the state. You know, at the federal level, they don't have to have a balanced budget. We all wish they had, but in the state of New Mexico, we have to have a balanced budget. And the quicker you can get there and recognize that, the fewer special sessions you will have, and to get there, you're going to have input from both parties and membership, and you have to treat them fairly on that. And I've prided myself as chair of the Senate Finance Committee that we have, I believe they will say that John Arthur Smith has been very fair in our committee.
One of the things that New Mexico is attempting, and all states are, is to diversify their revenue. And in an area that has seen some success is tourism. There's a new tourism director also coming on board.
Yes, there is, and we've expanded the funding for tourism. The secretary has now moved over to Children, Youth, and Families. She was very astute at managing people. She also was accountable for the dollars that was appropriated to her agency, and also reflected the results that she got with those additional dollars. She's been somewhat unique in the 26 years that I've been there, of saying, you gave me this is what I did, and these were the results on that. And tourism is huge in the state of New Mexico. But the bottom line is they still have to make certain, those secretaries, that they spend the money efficiently and economically.
But I mean, even your district depends pretty heavily. I look at the RV spaces that are in Deming every time I drive through, and it is a statewide kind of effort.
Yes, you know, if we can get the traveling public to stay an extra day in New Mexico, that's tourism when it's very, very efficient. And if we get them to stay 2 or 3 extra days, those are dollars that are going to flow into the state of New Mexico and local businesses.
And I would say that Deming, I feel very comfortable in saying that if they stayed the entire time during this long session in those parks, they'd be ecstatic.
They'd be ecstatic. But the bottom line is we have great weather down here. We talk about Deming, but Cruces is in my district, and I have a son that said Las Cruces is another Tucson, and it's just on the very front door of that. And so he envisions great things. I envision great things for southern New Mexico, but Cruces is sort of sitting right in the middle, right in the cradle.
And again, we have seen some increase in tourism to the benefit of the entire state.
Right.
Mental health issues and health care. Again, New Mexico is not the only state struggling with it, but there's been some rancor and there's been some issues. Do you see resolution in that? Do you see a path to provide the services that are going to be needed by the state?
You know, Senator Papin has led the charge. Former Senator Tim Jennings and former Senator Joe Carrero from Albuquerque sort of led the charge on that. I think the debate and discussion is certainly healthy because we have major deficiencies there. The issue at hand, I think you're talking about the behavioral health issue. Yes. Where 15 contractors were removed. We're still trying to find out what the cause was. I personally believe there might have been 3 wrongdoers, but I can't believe all 15 were wrongdoers. And I think there were 12 different providers that were removed from business, and here we are trying to attract business rather than repel it. And I'm waiting for the new Attorney General to make a final determination on the on those cases.
We look ahead here, and I'm going to state it this way, that perhaps as one of the wise stages of the legislative process in New Mexico, is there anything that you are pondering driving up to Santa Fe that you see as being a particular challenge that you want to try to champion and go after? Well,
New Mexico, at one time I wanted to overhaul the taxes overnight. Realism has set in, and it has to be a work in progress. Right now you have people saying, well, we shouldn't have given up corporate taxes. Well, if I recall correctly, the oil companies that are struggling right now are also corporations. And so I think it's lip service when you're shoving that responsibility off on somebody that has a declining revenue stream on that. I think my overall mission is to try and come up with a revenue stream that is more predictable, more reliable, than what we've had in the past, where when one is in decline, one will offset that. And that might be a pipe dream, so to speak. Hope you'll probably be talking about marijuana here in a minute. But the
I mean, again, but
Right.
in all seriousness, there is a proposal in there for medical marijuana
Right.
to be legalized. There's a lot of the things that are being, as usual, this early in the session. There's a lot of things being put forth that are never going to see the light of day. But that's one of them. Yes, and with Colorado wrestling with that, it is a hot topic at the moment.
medical marijuana has been legal here. The question of the distribution of that and how it's handled, that's still up in the air, and there's still great debate on that one. Recreational use of marijuana, I think the minority leader probably gave the most responsible response when he said, let's see what happens up in Colorado. I've had real concerns about legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes, because you know and I know the number of border patrolmen are going to enforce the federal law and not the state law. And I would hate for some of these young college students that are on leave to be detained, have to go out and hire an attorney. I don't think they're going to go off to jail, but I think there's some real inconveniences out there until the federal government decides to step to the plate on whichever direction they're going to go.
I think you're saying there needs to be a responsible approach
Right.
to that. Really quickly, anything that you personally hope to accomplish in this long session?
Well, I hope to come out with a balanced budget that treats New Mexicans as fair as I know how. It's always been my goal. I'm subject to a lot of ridicule on that. But when I entered the legislature, and this year, 26 years later, starting my 27th, whether the resources were abundant or whether they're sort of a weak supply, I've tried to be fair with the resources available in the state of New Mexico and meet them out in a responsible fashion. And that's my goal, to
Senator
do it again.
Smith, thank you so much for taking the time before you head up to
you.
Santa Fe. Safe travels and good luck with this session.
Thank you much.
Thank you for joining us for Your Legislators. I'm Glen Cerny. We'll be back next week with another conversation with one of your legislators. Thank you.